Admiral Jake Morrison stood in the smoking ruins of what had been New Eden Colony just 3 days ago. The air still carried the smell of burning metal and something worse that he tried not to think about. His boots crunched on broken glass as he walked through the main street where children had played and families had lived. Their quiet lives among the stars. The settlement had housed 50,000 people, men and women who had left Earth behind to build something new on this distant world. They had farms that grew food under alien suns and schools where human children learned about the galaxy they would inherit. Now there was nothing but twisted metal and ash where their dreams had been. Captain Lisa Grant walked beside him, carrying a datapad that held numbers no human should ever have to read. Her face was pale and her hands shook slightly as she gave her report. Every building had been targeted with precision weapons. Every shelter had been found and destroyed. Even the underground bunkers built to protect families during emergencies had been blasted open from above. The Zephian ships had come without warning in the middle of the night cycle when most people were sleeping. The orbital defense platforms that should have protected the colony had been the first targets hit. The communications array that should have called for help had been destroyed seconds after the attack began. The transport ships that could have carried civilians to safety had been turned to molten metal before anyone could reach them. Morrison knelt beside a small crater where the community center had stood. This was where people had gathered for celebrations and meetings, where couples had gotten married and children had taken their first steps. The Zephyrians had dropped something powerful enough to turn the entire building into a hole in the ground. Lisa read from her pad with a voice that barely stayed steady. The rescue teams had searched every building and every piece of wreckage they could find. No survivors had been located anywhere in the colony. The medical teams had stopped counting bodies after the first day. Because there were too many pieces to put back together, a transmission device had been found in the rubble of the science center, still playing a message over and over. Dr. Allen Foster had been the head scientist of the colony, and somehow he had managed to record something before the end came. His voice came through the static weak but clear enough to understand. The message said the Zephians had not attacked like soldiers trying to win a battle. They had moved through the colony slowly and carefully like researchers studying test subjects. They had recorded everything they did and measured how long it took people to die from different weapons. They had captured some families alive and experimented on them to see how humans reacted to pain and fear. Foster had said this was not war the way humans understood it. This was research being done by creatures who wanted to learn the best ways to kill every human in the galaxy. They had treated the people of New Eden like animals in a laboratory and taken notes while they screamed. The recording had ended with Foster saying the Zephyrians were coming for Earth next and they would use what they learned here to make sure no human survived anywhere. His last words had been a warning that humanity needed to understand they were fighting something that saw them as pests to be removed from the galaxy. After the attack was finished, the Zephyrian fleet had moved to a safe distance and broadcast a message on all human communication channels. The voice had been cold and mechanical, like someone reading a grocery list. It said the human species was too dangerous to be allowed to spread through space. Their ability to adapt and survive made them a threat to older, more established civilizations. The message had given humanity one choice. All human colonies and ships would withdraw to Earth immediately and never leave the solar system again. Any human found in space after 30 days would be killed along with everyone on whatever world or ship they were found on. The Zephyrians had said this was the only warning humanity would receive. Morrison stood up and looked at the ruins around him. The Zephyrians thought they had sent a message that would make humans afraid. They thought showing the destruction of New Eden would convince humanity to crawl back to Earth and hide like scared children. They thought fear would make humans give up everything they had worked to build among the stars the alien creatures had made. Calculations about human behavior based on what they had observed of other species in the galaxy. They had decided that, like every other race they had encountered, humans would choose survival over pride when faced with overwhelming force. They believed all intelligent life followed the same patterns of logic and self-preservation, but the Zephyrians had never met humans who had nothing left to lose. They had never seen what happened when someone pushed humanity past the point where survival mattered more than justice. They had just taught every human in the galaxy exactly what they were capable of when they stopped trying to be civilized. Morrison activated his communication device and sent a message back to Earth. The Zephyrians wanted to know what humans were really like when they were no longer playing by the rules of galactic society. They were about to find out, and Morrison was certain they would not like the lesson. The Great Chamber of the Galactic Council had never seen an emergency session quite like this one. Representatives from 47 different species sat in their assigned seats while holographic displays showed the complete destruction of New Eden Colony. The images played over and over, showing buildings reduced to rubble and the scattered remains of 50,000 human civilians. High Commander Vexstar of the Zephyrian Empire stood at the center of the chamber with his 4 arms spread wide in, a gesture his people used to show dominance. His scaled skin reflected the light from the displays as he spoke about the necessity of what his forces had done to the human settlement. His voice carried no emotion as he described the efficient elimination of what he called a growing threat to galactic stability. The Zephyrian commander activated his own display showing graphs and charts that tracked human expansion over the past 2 centuries. He pointed to colonies that had been established in systems where other species had failed to survive. He showed population growth rates that exceeded anything seen in galactic history. He displayed technological advancement curves that suggested humans would control significant portions of space. Within a few generations, Vexstar explained to the assembled delegates that mathematical projections indicated humanity would become the dominant species in the galaxy if allowed to continue their current rate of expansion. Their ability to adapt to hostile environments was unprecedented among known intelligent life. Their willingness to take risks that other species considered suicidal had allowed them to establish settlements in places no one else could live. The chamber listened as the Zephyrian presented recordings from the attack on New Eden. The footage showed human civilians trying to protect their children even when facing certain death. It showed families staying together in underground shelters instead of scattering to improve individual survival chances. It showed people attempting to help wounded strangers instead of running to save themselves. These behaviors confused the Zephyrian analysts who had expected humans to act rationally when faced with superior force. Instead, they had observed what Vexstar described as dangerously unpredictable responses that made humans impossible to control through normal intimidation methods. This unpredictability, combined with their rapid reproduction and technological development, made them a threat that required immediate elimination. The delegates from other species began to nod in agreement as they listened to the presentation. The Altarians, with their ancient wisdom, spoke of sensing something unsettling about human mental patterns. The Keplerians, who had existed for millions of years, mentioned that humans reminded them of a younger, more violent version of themselves. The peaceful Centauri Federation admitted they had been concerned about human military expansion. Each species shared their own observations about humanity that supported the Zephyrian position. The Draconians noted that humans had somehow learned to survive on a world with gravity that should have crushed their bones. The Arcturians mentioned that human soldiers seemed to lack proper fear responses during combat situations. The crystalline beings from Vega reported that humans had managed to communicate with their energy-based life forms in ways that should have been impossible. Ambassador Claire Phillips sat in the human section of the chamber listening to 46 different species explain why her people deserve to die. Each representative stood and gave clinical reasons why humanity posed a threat to galactic civilization. They spoke about humans like they were discussing the removal of a dangerous pest rather than the genocide of an entire intelligent species. The mathematical models were impressive, and the logic seemed sound to beings who had lived in the galaxy for millions of years. Humans had indeed expanded faster than any other known species. They had established colonies and systems that others had written off as uninhabitable. They had developed weapons and technologies at a rate that made older civilizations nervous about their own security. Phillips watched as species she had considered friends and allies voted to support the Zephyrian action against New Eden. The vote was not close and there was little debate about the necessity of containing human expansion through force. The only question seemed to be whether complete extermination was required or if humans could be safely contained within their home system. When the voting was complete, Vextar turned to Phillips with what might have been satisfaction in his alien features. He announced that the human delegate would now have the opportunity to formally announce her species' withdrawal from all contested space. The Galactic Council would generously allow humans to retain control of Earth and the other planets in their home system, provided they never attempted to leave again. Phillips stood slowly as every eye in the chamber focused on her. The weight of representing a species that had just been condemned by the galaxy pressed down on her shoulders. She looked around at faces both familiar and strange, knowing that each one had just voted to support the murder of 50,000 innocent people. She thought about the children who had died on New Eden and the families who had been torn apart by Zephyrian weapons. She thought about the scientists and farmers and teachers who had only wanted to build a better life among the stars. She thought about the message Dr. Foster had recorded while his world burned around him. When Phillips finally spoke, her voice was calm and steady despite the rage burning in her chest. She told the assembled delegates that they had made a serious error in their calculations about human behavior. They had observed humans who were trying to fit into galactic society and mistaken restraint for weakness. They had seen humans following the rules of civilization and assumed that was the limit of human capability. She explained that everything they had witnessed so far had been humanity on its best behavior. Humans had been trying very hard to be good neighbors and peaceful members of the galactic community. They had deliberately limited their expansion and moderated their natural tendencies in order to avoid frightening older species. The massacre at New Eden had changed the situation completely. Phillips continued. The Zephyrians and their supporters had just demonstrated that peaceful coexistence was not possible. They had shown humans exactly what the galaxy thought of them and what would happen if they continued trying to play by someone else's rules. Phillips looked directly at Vextar as she delivered her final statement. The Zephyrians had wanted to see what humans were truly capable of when they stopped holding back. They had wanted to understand why other species found humans so disturbing and unpredictable. They were about to get a comprehensive education in human nature, and she was certain they would not enjoy the lessons. President William Hayes stood before the combined emergency session of Congress and the Global Defense Council in the most secure facility on Earth. The faces looking back at him represented every nation and every branch of human government. They had all seen the footage from New Eden, and they had all heard the ultimatum from the Galactic Council. Now they had to decide what humanity would do next. The debate had been raging for 6 hours without any clear consensus emerging. Senator Corinne White from the Pacific Alliance argued that humanity should accept the terms and withdraw to Earth before more colonies were destroyed. She pointed out that the galaxy contained species with technology far beyond anything humans possessed, and that continued resistance would only lead to complete extinction. Representative Tony Miller from the North American Federation stood up, with fury in his voice as he rejected any talk of surrender. His daughter had been a teacher on New Eden working with human children who would never grow up because of Zephyrian weapons. He demanded that Earth mobilize every resource available to make the aliens pay for what they had done to innocent families. General Paul Carter entered the chamber carrying classified files that made several representatives pale when they saw the security markings. As head of Earth's combined military forces, he had access to projects that most government officials had never heard of. He placed 3 options before the assembly that would determine the future of the human species. The first option was complete surrender and withdrawal to Earth as demanded by the Galactic Council. This would save the lives of humans currently living on other colonies, but would end humanity's expansion into space forever. The second option was conventional military resistance, using existing weapons and tactics which would certainly fail given the technological superiority of their enemies. The third option was something called Project Pandora that had been developed in secret over the past 50 years. General Carter explained that this project had been created as a last resort if humanity ever faced extinction from external threats. The files he carried contained research that challenged everything humans thought they knew about their own limitations. Dr. Helen Ross stepped forward as the head of Advanced Weapons Research to explain what Project Pandora actually involved. She activated holographic displays showing human genetic structures and neural patterns that had been mapped and analyzed since the project began. The research had been inspired by observations that other species found humans unsettling in ways they could not properly explain. Ross explained that every other species in the galaxy had evolved on worlds that were relatively stable and safe compared to Earth. They had developed intelligence and civilization without facing the constant life-threatening challenges that had shaped human evolution. As a result, they had never developed the extreme adaptability and survival instincts that made humans different from everyone else. The project had spent decades studying what made humans unique and why other species reacted to them with instinctive fear. The research had discovered that humans possessed genetic and psychological traits that had been suppressed by civilization but could be enhanced and amplified through careful modification. These traits represented the raw survival mechanisms that had allowed humans to dominate Earth despite being physically weaker than many other species. Project Pandora had developed methods to remove the psychological and genetic limitations that civilization had placed on human development. The modifications would enhance physical capabilities far beyond normal human ranges while removing the mental barriers that prevented humans from using their full potential. The volunteers would become something that retained human intelligence and creativity while unleashing the predatory instincts that had made humans the apex species on Earth. President Hayes read through the classified documentation with growing concern about what the project would actually create. The modifications were irreversible and would fundamentally change anyone who underwent the process. The volunteers would retain their memories and personalities, but their basic nature would be altered in ways that could never be undone. Dar Ross admitted that the enhanced humans would be dangerous to everyone, including other humans, once the modifications were complete. They would possess capabilities that normal humans could not match and psychological drives that civilization had spent thousands of years learning to control. The project represented humanity abandoning the restraints they had placed on themselves in order to become something that could survive in a hostile galaxy. Captain Ryan Brooks stood up in the gallery representing the families who had lost people on New Eden. His wife and 2 children had been among the 50,000 civilians murdered by the Zephyrians, and he had volunteered to be among the first test subjects for Project Pandora. He spoke for the thousands of other volunteers who were willing to undergo irreversible changes if it meant preventing more colonies from being destroyed. Brooks explained that the Zephyrians had made the mistake of showing humans exactly what they were facing. The aliens had demonstrated that they viewed humans as laboratory animals to be studied and eliminated when convenient. They had proven that peaceful coexistence was impossible and that humanity's only choice was to become something the galaxy had never encountered before. The volunteers understood that they would no longer be completely human after the modifications were finished. They accepted that they might become something that frightened other people, including their own families. But they also knew that the alternative was watching humanity slowly die while hiding on Earth like prisoners in their own solar system. The vote was called after 12 hours of debate, and the result was unanimous. Every representative from every nation on Earth agreed that Project Pandora should be activated immediately. Humanity would transform itself into something that could not be eliminated by species who had grown comfortable with their position in the galaxy. President Hayes signed the authorization, knowing that he was changing the course of human evolution forever. The species that had tried so hard to fit into galactic civilization was about to discover what they were really capable of when they stopped trying to be acceptable to everyone else. The Zephyrians had wanted to see what made humans dangerous, and they were about to get a demonstration that would terrify the entire galaxy. Commander Beth Andrews stood in the briefing room aboard the stealth ship heading toward Zephyrian space and barely recognized herself in the reflection from the metal walls. 6 months of Project Pandora modifications had changed her body and mind in ways that still surprised her when she moved or thought too quickly. Her bones were now 3 times denser than normal human bones, and her muscles contained fibers that could generate forces no baseline human could match. The 23 other members of Alpha Squadron sat around her in the cramped space, and each one showed the same kinds of changes that made them look like humans, who had been redesigned by someone with very different ideas about what the species should be capable of. Their reflexes had been enhanced to levels that allowed them to move faster than most other species could even see. Their pain receptors had been modified so they could register damage without becoming incapacitated by the sensations, but the physical changes were nothing compared to what had been done to their minds and psychological responses. The fear mechanisms that kept normal humans from taking extreme risks had been removed completely. The social inhibitions that prevented humans from using maximum violence had been carefully eliminated. The protective instincts that made humans willing to die for their families had been amplified until they applied to every other human in the galaxy. Andrews remembered what she had been like before the modifications began and sometimes wondered if the person she used to be would have approved of what she had become. The old Beth Andrews had been a career military officer who followed regulations and tried to minimize casualties even among enemy forces. The new version looked at the universe through eyes that saw only threats to be eliminated and problems to be solved through the application of overwhelming force. Their target was a Zephyrian research station in a system that officially did not exist on any galactic charts. Intelligence reports indicated that the facility was being used to study captured human civilians who had been taken alive during raids on isolated settlements. The researchers wanted to understand human social bonding and pain tolerance so they could develop more effective methods for eliminating the species. Admiral Vecalon commanded the research station and had been personally conducting experiments on human prisoners for over a year. His reports to the Zephyrian military described humans as fascinating test subjects who displayed behavioral patterns unlike any other known intelligent species. He had been particularly interested in how humans continued to protect each other even when doing so guaranteed their own deaths. The stealth ship dropped out of faster than light travel at the edge of the system and immediately began moving toward the research station using engines that produced no detectable emissions. The facility had been built inside a large asteroid to hide it from casual observation, but the humans had been tracking its location for months, using methods the Zephyrians did not know existed. Andrews reviewed the intelligence files one more time as her squadron prepared for the assault. The research station contained approximately 200 Zephyrian scientists and military personnel, along with an unknown number of human prisoners being held in the experimental sections. The facility was defended by automated weapon systems and had a small fleet of patrol ships that could respond to any attack within minutes. Under normal circumstances, the mission would have been considered impossible for such a small force. The research station was heavily fortified, and the Zephyrians had technology that was centuries ahead of anything baseline humans could deploy. But Alpha Squadron was no longer operating under normal human limitations, and they had been equipped with weapons designed specifically for their enhanced capabilities. The assault began when the stealth ship attached itself to the outer hull of the asteroid and began cutting through the metal barriers that protected the research station. The Pandora units moved through the corridors like predators that had been designed specifically for this environment. Their enhanced reflexes allowed them to react to threats before the Zephyrians could even begin to respond. Security footage that was later recovered by other species showed something that would become legendary throughout the galaxy for all the wrong reasons. The enhanced humans moved through the facility with a coordination that seemed almost telepathic as they systematically eliminated every threat they encountered. They shrugged off weapons fire that should have killed them instantly, and continued fighting even when suffering injuries that would have incapacitated normal humans. The Zephyrian defenders had been trained to fight against conventional military forces using established tactics and predictable behavior patterns. They had never encountered enemies who moved like Andrews and her squadron or who seemed completely immune to fear and pain. The battle was over in 17 minutes and not a single human had been seriously injured. Sub-Admiral Thekalon found himself cornered in his laboratory surrounded by the results of his experiments on human prisoners. Charts and recordings covered the walls showing the torture methods he had developed and the detailed notes he had taken while humans screamed. He tried to activate a communication device to call for help, but Andrews crushed it with her bare hand before he could send a signal. The Zephyrian scientist attempted to negotiate by offering to release the human prisoners and abandon his research. He explained that he had only been following orders from his superiors and that his work was contributing to scientific knowledge that would benefit all species in the galaxy. He promised to share his findings with human researchers if they would spare his life. Andrews stared at Thekalon with eyes that had been modified to process visual information faster than any baseline human could manage. She had watched recordings of every experiment he had conducted and read transcripts of every scream he had recorded for analysis. The old Beth Andrews might have accepted his surrender and taken him prisoner for interrogation. The new version had different priorities. She spoke in a voice that carried no emotion as she explained what was about to happen to him. The Zephyrians had wanted to understand what made humans different from other species and why they were so difficult to control through normal methods. Thekalon had spent over a year studying human responses to pain and fear while taking detailed notes on his observations. Andrews told him that his education was about to continue in a much more personal way. He was going to learn exactly what humans were capable of when they stopped trying to be civilized and started being what evolution had designed them to be. The lesson would be comprehensive, and she guaranteed that he would understand human nature completely before it was finished. The research station went dark 3 days later when Zephyrian reinforcements finally arrived to investigate the loss of communication. They found every alien on the facility dead, but every human prisoner alive and unharmed. Written on the walls in Zephyrian blood was a simple message that would be repeated throughout their space in the months that followed. It said that this had been Lesson 1 and that humans remembered everything. Colonel Nick Stone crouched in the ventilation system of a Zephyrian military academy and listened to the sounds of normal life continuing below him. Students attended classes where they learned about galactic history and military tactics, while their instructors discussed the ongoing human problem as if it were a minor inconvenience that would soon be resolved. None of them knew that death was crawling through the walls above their heads. Bravo Squadron had been operating in Zephyrian space for 8 months as part of what military planners called the Phantom Campaign. Unlike traditional warfare that focused on destroying enemy resources and capturing territory, the enhanced humans were conducting a different kind of battle. They were systematically destroying the Zephyrian sense of security by demonstrating that nowhere in their space was truly safe from human reach. The academy was located on the Zephyrian homeworld, deep inside their most heavily defended territory. It trained the officers who would lead future military operations against human colonies and taught the tactics that would be used to complete the extermination of the human species. The facility was surrounded by orbital defense platforms and protected by the most advanced security systems in the Zephyrian military. Stone had been a Special Forces operator before Project Pandora transformed him into something that barely qualified as human anymore. The modifications had enhanced his physical capabilities to levels that allowed him to infiltrate installations that should have been impossible to breach. More importantly, they had removed the psychological barriers that would have prevented him from doing what needed to be done to enemy civilians. The mission was not to destroy the academy or kill everyone inside it. The goal was to demonstrate that human forces could reach any target they chose and that Zephyrian security was completely ineffective against enemies who operated outside the normal rules of warfare. Stone and his team would leave evidence of their presence and vanish before reinforcements could respond. He dropped silently through a maintenance shaft into the Academy's main computer center where records of every student and instructor were stored. The Zephyrians kept detailed files on everyone who passed through their military education system, including personal information about families and home colonies. Stone began downloading everything while his enhanced reflexes allowed him to monitor multiple security feeds simultaneously. The data would be used to track down individual Zephyrians who had participated in planning or supporting the attack on New Eden. Human intelligence had identified thousands of military officers who had voted to approve the genocide or contributed to the weapons development that made it possible. Each name on the list would eventually receive a personal visit from a Pandora unit. Stone moved through the facility like a ghost who could appear and disappear at will. His enhanced senses allowed him to detect Zephyrian patrol patterns and avoid security cameras, while his modified muscle fibers let him move without making any sound that normal hearing could detect. He left small devices in strategic locations that would activate days after his departure. The devices were not weapons in any conventional sense. They were designed to play recordings of human voices taken from the New Eden massacre at random intervals throughout the Academy. Students and instructors would hear the screams of children and the final words of families as they died in Zephyrian experiments. The psychological impact would be far more devastating than any explosive device. Major Susan Davis, lead Charlie. Squadron in a simultaneous operation against Admiral Vextar himself aboard his flagship deep in Zephyrian military space. The architect of the New Eden massacre had believed he was safe, surrounded by the most powerful fleet in the galaxy and protected by security measures that had never been successfully breached by any known enemy. Davis and her team had infiltrated the massive battleship by hiding in supply containers that were routinely transported aboard without detailed inspection. The enhanced humans had been able to survive in sealed containers for days without air or water by entering metabolic states that were impossible for baseline humans to achieve. They emerged inside the ship's cargo bay like nightmares coming to life. The Zephyrian crew had no idea that enemies were aboard their vessel as the enhanced humans moved through the ship's corridors with perfect stealth. They disabled security systems and eliminated guards without triggering any alarms while making their way toward the command sections where Vextar maintained his headquarters. Davis had studied every available recording of the Zephyrian admiral, including his speeches to the Galactic Council where he had explained why human extinction was necessary for galactic stability. She had watched footage of him reviewing the destruction of New Eden and expressing satisfaction at the efficiency of the operation. The old Susan Davis would have arrested him for war crimes. The new version had different plans. The admiral was alone in his private quarters reviewing tactical reports when Davis appeared in his doorway like death given physical form. His security systems had not detected any intrusion and his guards had not raised any alarms. One moment he was safe aboard his flagship, and the next moment he was staring at a human who should not have been able to exist. Vextar tried to activate emergency protocols, but Davis moved faster than his nervous system could process and disabled his communication systems before he could call for help. She explained in a calm voice that his ship was now under human control and that his crew was being systematically eliminated by forces they could not detect or resist. The Zephyrian admiral demanded to know how humans had developed technology capable of infiltrating his flagship. Davis smiled with an expression that contained no warmth as she explained that they had not used technology to reach him. They had simply become something that his people were not equipped to fight against. She forced Vextar to watch as his carefully organized fleet began to fall apart around him. Pandora units were simultaneously attacking ships throughout his formation, using methods that Zephyrian military doctrine had never anticipated. The aliens had prepared to fight against conventional enemies who followed predictable patterns of behavior. They had never considered what would happen if they faced opponents who had been designed specifically to hunt them. The psychological warfare was more effective than any conventional weapon could have been. Zephyrian military discipline began to collapse as reports flooded in of impossible attacks by enemies who seemed to appear from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. Ship commanders started refusing orders and colonial governors began abandoning their positions rather than wait for human forces to find them. Davis sat across from Vexstar in his own command chair as she explained what humanity had become in response to his actions. The massacre at New Eden had taught humans exactly who they were when they stopped trying to fit into galactic civilization. The Zephyrians had awakened something that had been sleeping in human DNA since the species first learned to hunt on the plains of Africa. The Admiral watched his empire begin to crumble as enhanced humans demonstrated that all Zephyrian advantages in technology and numbers meant nothing when facing enemies who no longer followed the rules that governed civilized warfare. He realized, too late, that his people had made a fundamental error in their calculations about human nature and capabilities. Davis left Vexstar alive aboard his crippled flagship with a simple message for any Zephyrians who found him. The hunt had only just begun and humanity intended to visit every individual who had supported the genocide, until they understood exactly what they had unleashed through their actions. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in a chamber that now felt very different from the confident gathering that had approved the destruction of New Eden 2 years earlier. Representatives from 47 species sat in seats that many of them wished they could abandon as they watched reports of human activities throughout the galaxy. The holographic displays no longer showed human colonies being destroyed, but instead documented the systematic collapse of civilizations that had supported genocide. The Zephyrian Empire no longer existed as a functioning government. Their military commanders had either surrendered or simply disappeared rather than face enhanced human forces that seemed to appear anywhere they chose. Their colonies had been abandoned by populations that could no longer tolerate the psychological pressure of knowing that death could visit them at any moment. Their homeworld had become a place where citizens huddled in underground shelters and waited for nightmares to find them. Ambassador Claire Phillips sat in the same seat she had occupied during the vote that condemned her species to extinction. But the woman who had once pleaded for understanding now looked at the assembled delegates with eyes that held no sympathy for their current situation. The transformation of humanity had changed more than just the enhanced soldiers who carried out military operations. It had changed how every human viewed their relationship with the rest of the galaxy. The Altarian delegate stood with shaking limbs as he tried to explain what his ancient and wise species had learned about human activities in their territory. Pandora units had appeared on their worlds not to conquer or destroy, but to deliver what they called educational experiences. Individual Altarians who had voted to support the New Eden massacre had been visited by enhanced humans who wanted to discuss the decision in detail. The conversations had not involved physical violence, but had instead focused on helping the Altarians understand exactly what their vote had meant to human families. The enhanced humans had showed them recordings of children dying in Zephyrian experiments and explained how each Altarian vote had contributed to those deaths. They had made it clear that the galaxy's oldest and wisest species would be held accountable for their role in genocide. Similar reports came from every species that had supported the Zephyrian action. The Keplerians described visits from humans who had demonstrated abilities that violated their understanding of physics and biology. The Centauri Federation reported that their peaceful colonies had been infiltrated by forces that moved like ghosts and left behind evidence that nowhere was beyond human reach. The Draconians, who prided themselves on their warrior culture, admitted that human-enhanced soldiers had challenged their greatest fighters to individual combat and won every encounter without apparent effort. The crystalline beings from Vega reported that humans had somehow learned to interact with their energy-based life forms in ways that caused permanent psychological damage. Each species shared stories of enhanced humans who had appeared in their most secure facilities and delivered personal messages to individuals who had participated in the vote against humanity. The messages were always the same basic concept, delivered in different ways depending on the species involved. Humans wanted everyone who had supported genocide to understand exactly what they had done and why it had been a mistake. The mathematical models that had once seemed so logical now looked like the miscalculations of children who had never encountered a truly dangerous predator. The projections about human expansion and technological development had been completely wrong because they had been based on observations of humans who were deliberately restraining themselves to fit into galactic society. Philip stood slowly as every eye in the chamber focused on her with expressions ranging from fear to desperate hope for mercy. She looked around at faces that had once condemned her species with casual indifference and now waited to learn whether they would be allowed to continue existing. The transformation was complete, and she could see that even the oldest and most powerful species in the galaxy finally understood what they were dealing with. She began speaking in the same calm voice she had used 2 years earlier, but now the words carried weight that made the assembled delegates lean forward in their seats. The humans had received an excellent education about galactic politics and the true nature of the species they had tried so hard to befriend. The lesson had been expensive but very thorough. Phillips explained that humanity had spent centuries trying to become acceptable to civilizations that viewed them as dangerous animals that needed to be controlled or eliminated. They had modified their behavior and limited their expansion in order to avoid frightening species that had enjoyed peace and stability for millions of years. They had tried very hard to be good neighbors and responsible members of the galactic community. The vote to support the Zephyrian genocide had taught humans that peaceful coexistence was not possible with species that would casually approve the murder of 50,000 civilians. The galaxy had demonstrated that it viewed humanity as a problem to be solved rather than a species to be welcomed. The lesson had been received and understood completely. She continued by explaining that the enhanced humans operating throughout the galaxy were not interested in conquest or traditional military objectives. They were teachers who wanted to ensure that the mistake made at New Eden would never be repeated by any species anywhere in the galaxy. The education process would continue until every civilization understood why genocide was never an acceptable solution to political problems. The Kepler Prime Delegate, who was older than most stars in the galaxy, tried to speak with a voice that trembled with age and fear. He attempted to explain that his people had not understood the full implications of their vote and that they had been influenced by mathematical projections rather than malicious intent. Phillips nodded with understanding as she acknowledged that many species had indeed acted from fear rather than hatred. The enhanced humans had taken this into account when designing their educational programs. Species that had supported genocide from ignorance would receive different lessons than those who had acted from deliberate malice. But everyone who had voted would receive some form of instruction. Reports began flooding into the chamber as delegates received communications from their homeworlds describing ongoing human activities. The enhanced soldiers were not conducting random attacks, but were instead systematically visiting every individual who had participated in the decision to support the New Eden massacre. Each person was receiving a personally designed educational experience that would help them understand human nature. The Galactic Council finally understood that they were not facing a conventional military campaign that could be resolved through negotiation or surrender. Humanity had transformed itself into something that existed outside the normal rules of galactic civilization. They had become teachers who would continue their lessons until they were satisfied that their students had learned the material. Admiral Jake Morrison appeared in the chamber through a holographic communication link from the command ship of what was now being called the Pandora Fleet. His presence caused several delegates to move away from their communication devices as if physical distance could provide protection from enhanced humans. Morrison looked directly at the assembled representatives as he delivered what humanity considered to be their final statement on the matter. The Galactic Council had voted to support genocide, and now they would learn why that had been the greatest mistake in galactic history. The educational process would continue at whatever pace was necessary to ensure complete understanding. The galaxy had wanted to see what humans were truly capable of when they stopped trying to be civilized. The demonstration would continue until every species understood why they should have chosen friendship instead of fear,